Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I am Esther Adams. Today, I want to build something with you slowly, piece by piece. We are going to talk about how an avoidant partner is made, not just the cheating or the dramatic exits or the other headline behavior that usually gets attached to this word. Instead, we are going to look underneath all of that at the early lessons that quietly teach someone that closeness is something to manage rather than something to trust. Here is the puzzle I want to open with. I suspect many of you have watched it happen in someone, maybe even in yourselves. A person meets someone new. For a while, everything moves the way you would hope it would. There is warmth, there is curiosity, there is that particular electricity of being known by someone for the first time. And then, right when the relationship would normally deepen, something shifts. The same person who leaned in starts leaning back. Conversations that used to feel easy now feel like negotiations. Vulnerability, which used to arrive on its own, suddenly has to be pulled out, almost against resistance. It is tempting to read this as a loss of interest. Often that reading is wrong. What is usually happening instead is that closeness itself has crossed a threshold, and crossing that threshold has quietly activated something old. That something old has a name in the research. It is called attachment avoidance. It is built around what psychologists call deactivating strategies. In plain terms, this means a person has learned to turn down the volume on their own attachment needs rather than express them. It is not that they do not need closeness. It is that they actively manage that need, almost like a thermostat set permanently low, because at some point in their history, needing someone openly did not go well. Here is what that can look like in an ordinary moment before we get into where it comes from. Picture a couple sitting on the couch after a hard day. One partner starts to cry just a little about something unrelated to the relationship itself, maybe a stressful week at work. The other partner sits very still, offers a quick pat on the shoulder, and then, within about a minute, changes the subject to dinner plans. From the outside, that might look like mild discomfort or simple awkwardness around crying. What is often happening underneath is something faster and older than that, a reflex that treats someone else's open need as a kind of pressure and quietly moves to relieve that pressure rather than sit inside it. So let's slow down and ask where that thermostat setting actually comes from. Research points to several common pathways, and I want to walk through them one at a time because each one teaches a slightly different version of the same lesson. First, emotional unavailability. A caregiver offers food, shelter, and structure, but responds poorly to feeling itself. A child cries and meets irritation or silence instead of comfort. Over time, that child learns that emotional expression will be ignored or treated as an inconvenience and adapts by suppressing the need and appearing unusually self sufficient. Adults around them may even praise how easy the child seems to be without ever seeing what that ease is quietly costing underneath. Next, the rejection of vulnerability. Some children are told in one form or another to stop being so sensitive or to deal with things themselves, often enough that self protection stops being a choice and becomes closer to reflex. Vulnerability starts to feel dangerous rather than natural, and that shift can happen surprisingly early. There is also a pathway that runs in the opposite direction, and it tends to surprise people. This is intrusive or controlling caregiving, where closeness itself becomes the threat. Privacy is not respected. The child's emerging sense of self keeps getting overridden. In a household like that, distance is not coldness. It is the only reliable way the child has found to protect an identity that is still trying to form. A fourth pathway is conditional affection. Love shows up mainly in exchange for good behavior, quiet compliance, or protecting the family's image in front of others. Emotional acceptance gets tied to performance rather than to simply existing as you are, and closeness quietly starts to feel like being evaluated, almost like a test that never really ends. And then there is repeated disappointment, which might be the most ordinary of these pathways. And maybe because of that, one of the most common. A child reaches for comfort again and again and gets very little back. Eventually, they stop reaching. Here is the detail I want you to sit with because it gets misunderstood constantly. The need for connection does not disappear when a child stops asking for it out loud. What disappears is the conscious awareness of that need. The wanting goes underground. It does not go away. Family instability adds its own layer on top of all of this. Chronic conflict between parents, unpredictable caregiving, or outright abuse can all shape this same avoidance strategy. Over time, the instability itself becomes the lesson, even when no single event stands out as the obvious cause. What tends to accumulate across all of these pathways is a quiet, internal rule book. It is never written down. It still governs behavior with real force. Rules like, I should not need anyone. Closeness costs me my freedom. If I depend on someone, I have handed them power over me. My emotions make relationships harder, so I will keep them to myself. These beliefs mostly operate below conscious awareness, but you can see their fingerprints clearly in adulthood. Automatic emotional shutdown, discomfort receiving comfort, real difficulty naming feelings even when someone asks gently. Now let's look at the actual weight of evidence behind these pathways because one finding stands out with unusual consistency. Emotional neglect and emotional maltreatment show the strongest, most consistent links to adult attachment avoidance, more so than physical abuse once you separate the two apart. Sexual abuse, interestingly, tends to track more closely with anxious attachment instead, a pattern built more around fear of abandonment and unworthiness than fear of being controlled or engulfed. So, avoidance is often less a scar left by the most visible or severe form of harm. It is more often the residue of something quieter, a caregiver who simply was not emotionally reachable, often enough that this became the expected shape of closeness itself. It also seems to matter who the mistreatment came from. Harm from within the family, and in some of this research specifically from a father figure, appears to leave a deeper mark on adult attachment than similar harm coming from outside the home. That makes a certain intuitive sense to me, because the family is supposed to be the first place a child learns whether closeness is survivable. When that first proof fails, the lesson tends to generalize outward. There is also some evidence that a child's broader sense of having support around them, even outside the immediate caregiver, can soften this pathway somewhat, which tells us this outcome is not fixed by one relationship alone. We understand fairly well then what predicts this pattern. What is less settled is exactly how those early experiences carry forward into adult behavior. A few mechanisms have reasonably consistent support, and I want to name three of them clearly because we will come back to these terms later. The first is emotional suppression. This means habitually pushing down feelings like anger, fear, or grief, almost like keeping a lid tightly closed on a pot instead of ever checking what is simmering underneath. The second is low trust in attachment figures, meaning the adult version of the story becomes expecting closeness to be a threat rather than a source of safety, which naturally produces withdrawal before anything has even gone wrong. The third is preemptive defense, where attention gets redirected away from anything that might trigger vulnerable feelings before those feelings even fully register consciously. In practice, this can look like someone changing the subject the instant a conversation turns emotionally serious, not on purpose, but because some earlier part of the process has already rerouted their attention elsewhere. There is another line of research that looks at this from a slightly different angle. It focuses not on emotion regulation directly, but on the internal templates, or schemas, that early adversity tends to leave behind. Think of a schema as a standing belief about how the world works, one that gets triggered automatically rather than reasoned through in the moment. Three of these show up often alongside avoidance: emotional deprivation, the quiet expectation that your needs will not be met, so there is little point voicing them; emotional inhibition, the belief that expressing feeling openly is unsafe or embarrassing, closer to a rule than a preference. And social isolation, the sense of standing slightly outside every group, never quite belonging the way others seem to. Together, these may form part of the cognitive scaffolding underneath the avoidant pattern, the actual beliefs running quietly in the background every time closeness starts to feel like too much. I also want to be honest about the limits here, because a field this active rarely produces one clean, unanimous story. Some well designed studies find no meaningful link between attachment avoidance specifically and broader mental health outcomes following childhood adversity. That complicates any simple narrative where avoidance is treated as the single thread running through everything. Other research finds that avoidant attachment does not meaningfully change how strongly childhood maltreatment predicts later difficulties, like post traumatic stress. Much of this work is also cross sectional, meaning it captures people at one point in time rather than following them forward across years, which makes it harder to say with full confidence which piece is cause and which is consequence. I think it is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than smoothing it over, because an honest picture here is more useful than a tidy one. Let's bring this down out of the research and into the room, because this is where the pattern actually becomes visible day to day, and it rarely announces itself as dramatically as people expect. Here's what preemptive defense and defensive isolation can look like in practice. From the outside, it can look like remarkable calm under pressure. From the inside, it often functions more like a shutdown that happened before the person even chose it. In the middle of conflict specifically, this kind of withdrawal limits how much influence a partner is allowed to have over the outcome. Going quiet or emotionally unavailable exactly when a disagreement needs resolving is not neutral. It leaves the other person feeling like they are arguing with a locked door rather than a person. Difficulty identifying emotions shows up here too, and this one surprises people because it can look like dishonesty when it is often closer to genuine confusion. Someone might be asked what they are feeling in a moment of real tension and simply not have reliable access to the answer. Not because they are hiding it, but because the whole system was built very early to keep that information from surfacing too easily. Research on empathy adds one more layer worth sitting with. Avoidant attachment tends to correlate with lower compassion in response to someone else's visible distress, and with a reduced ability to take another person's perspective. Researchers describe this as a deactivating response to another person's pain, meaning the avoidant partner may actually distance themselves emotionally and sometimes physically at the exact moment their partner needs them to move closer. This is not the same as not caring. It often looks more like the caring gets interrupted by an older, faster reflex that treats someone else's need as a demand on resources the avoidant partner does not feel they have to give. I want to pause on something here because it would be easy to walk away thinking avoidant partners are simply cold. That has not been my experience, either clinically or in the research. These are often people who feel a great deal. They attach strongly, they can become quite jealous or protective, and they genuinely want the things a relationship offers: stability, family, physical closeness, a sense of belonging somewhere. What they struggle with specifically is the part of intimacy that requires ongoing dependence, transparency, and letting someone else's needs actually reshape their own behavior in real time. So you often end up with someone who wants closeness, while also, usually without full awareness, working quite hard to control exactly how much of it gets in. It can look like someone who plans the wedding, buys the house, shows up for years of ordinary partnership, and still keeps a quiet inner room that the other person is never quite invited into. There is a metaphor I find useful here, and I want to offer it carefully. Think of the nervous system, in this context, like a smoke alarm calibrated very early, on one stove, in one kitchen, years before the person ever met the partner sitting across from them now. That alarm does not know this relationship is different. It only knows the pattern it was trained on, and it goes off the moment something resembles the original threat closely enough, whether or not anything dangerous is actually happening in the present moment. Understanding that the alarm is outdated does not silence it by itself, but it does change what a person can do the next time it goes off because now they know it is an alarm rather than an accurate read of the situation. So, can any of this change? I want to answer that as honestly as the evidence allows, rather than as reassuringly as it might feel to promise. The evidence suggests these defensive patterns are not entirely fixed. Attachment related behavior can shift with significant life experience, even though certain older vulnerabilities and reflexes often remain in the background. Clinically, a strong, carefully built therapeutic alliance matters, especially for avoidant clients, because their default setting is to view support itself with some suspicion. That makes the relationship harder to build, and once it is built, unusually meaningful. There is also a genuinely interesting finding suggesting that role demands can sometimes override avoidant defenses directly. Parents who show real attachment and security in most areas of life can still adapt their caregiving in the moment. A child's distress clearly exceeds their own. That tells us the avoidance system is not a permanent ceiling. It can be overridden, at least temporarily, when the stakes and the role are clear enough. There is also encouraging research connecting general self awareness and social awareness to attachment security more broadly. That suggests these capacities are not fixed traits a person either has or lacks. They appear to be skills, in the more ordinary sense of that word, meaning they can be built deliberately over time. I do want to be honest about where the evidence still runs thin. We have solid research describing what keeps this pattern stable: the defensive isolation, the empathy deficits, the withdrawal that quietly limits a partner's influence. What we have much less of is long term evidence showing that a specific intervention reliably reduces avoidance in a way researchers can measure and predict ahead of time. The field, as it stands, can describe the walls with real precision. It is still working out, with much less confidence, exactly which key reliably opens them. So let's come back to where we started. The avoidant partner is not simply someone who does not care. This is not mainly a story about one moment of betrayal or one dramatic exit. It is the accumulated result of a nervous system that learned early and thoroughly that closeness came with a cost, and that built an elaborate, mostly unconscious system to minimize how often that cost would ever have to be paid again. Understanding that architecture does not excuse the moments where it hurts the people standing closest to it. Compassion for where a pattern comes from is not the same thing as removing responsibility for what someone does with it now. Instead, understanding the making of the avoidant partner tells us where the real work has to happen, not in the dramatic moments of withdrawal themselves, but in the smaller, quieter moments just before them, where a different response becomes possible once it has been practiced enough to be available when it matters. If you recognize someone you love in this today, or if you recognized yourself, I would offer this as the question worth carrying with you. Not simply, where did this come from? Because that question alone tends to stop at explanation and go no further. The more useful version is, now that I can see where this came from, what is one small moment this week where I could stay half a second longer than the old alarm wants me to? That small margin, repeated often enough, tends to be where real change actually lives. Thank you for spending this time with me. I am Esther Adams, and I will see you next time on Strides to Solutions.